Hey y'alls, welcome back to ANT 315. This is Dr. Edwards and here to help you out with Module 5, Cultural Identity, Food, Folklore, and Mythology. So, some pretty in-depth readings this week, fellas. I want to start with giving you a general overview, then I want to focus in on some of our readings a bit to try to help you out in better understanding them and highlight key points. So, in general, this week is really all about food production and consumption, and being much more than just about food. Okay, I might look at a plate of scrambled eggs and be like, that's food. But it's another thing to consider all the things that went into producing that food. Okay, for consumption, and that really speaks to size and scale of the society that's doing the production and consuming the goods. We have a very in-depth article about corn wars this week, which on one level gives a very detailed analysis of Chinese individuals engaging in corporate espionage, pretty much, to steal hybrid corn and genetically modified corn types. Now, in addition to that specific case, which really kind of gives nice insights into the importance of such things on a global scale, there's also a really concise exploration of agricultural history. And its major shifts through time. So those are some really important things to have a good understanding of, right? The case study of the Chinese stealing corn types and GMOs is really kind of unique because it was, if I remember right, it was the first time that the federal government actually used surveillance on companies officially. In the Chinese example, it really kind of highlights the political power involved, and so we're looking beyond kind of just the ecology involved in agricultural production, but looking also at how food production and consumption is economic and political. Okay. It also has significant impacts to the environment, right? When we shift from very small scale systems, they can even be industrial small scale. But when you get to large scale industrialized mechanized production of foodstuffs, it's a whole other kettle of fish, right? I actually highly recommend. I shared it last week, but I'll mention it again. Overshoot by Caton. This is here. Let me hold it straight. This is an excellent text. I'm also including a nice overview of cultural ecology and include a full text, an introductory text to cultural ecology, which is a theoretical perspective that helps us understand these relationships. Let's see here. Looking at my notes. Moving kind of on to the more to our text readings, not the Corn Wars article, but the chapter 5 in our main text. It really focuses on commercial factory food systems, right? And I often use, industrialized food production. Same thing, right? And it really highlights, the associations at different scales. When we're talking about local food production, which was 95% back in 1790. 95% of American society was rural and often directly engaged in producing their own food. And They may actually redistribute it locally, but it wasn't shared, coast to coast or on an international scale, right, global scale, which, in 2000 we were up to, was it 79% urban population, which is all the more reliant on this massive food production system, right? Without it, you can't support these very dense population centers. Like, think about New York. Most people in New York like living in New York City, not the state. Um, they live in apartments, right? These people are not growing their own food, right? They have to get it from somewhere, and that usually comes from our agricultural heartland, and it's distributed, which burns fossil fuels, and transported and redistributed through various stores and whatnot. The scale is so important to keep in mind here, because when we increase the scale overall, we have some pretty severe effects, both socially, culturally, politically, and economically, and also environmentally. So to kind of get a better understanding of these, I'd really like you to check out Marvin Harris. He, in our readings, he offers some insights into techno-environmental advantage versus greater efficiency of foraging. And this is, he uses a very specific equation, which is the hours expended per farm worker multiplied by the fixed rate of 150 calories per hour, divided by the quantity of calories produced. And that equals the energy input and output ratios for a particular system. However, we also need to include fossil fuels. When we're looking at more traditional systems that are not using mechanized production, you take that out. When you're looking at industrialized systems that are fundamentally based on mechanized industrial production, you have to include the fossil fuels. And actually, a really good example of that is, we call those was it phantom carrying capacity or ghost acreage? And this really highlights, the extra inputs that we use from various sources. You know, uh, think of the ocean, all the stuff that we harvest from that. That is not looking at what the land can support, right? Because our land is fixed, but we move outside of that realm, and we're exploiting resources from another source. Imports are another good way to look at that. How much do we import from other countries to serve food needs here? Um, those sorts of extras, right? We have to account for them. It's a really important aspect. So Marvin Harris, a really important contributor to this. Howard Odom, he does a great job looking at energy flows. When limited to local inputs, solar energy, traditional societies do not harness enough power to over disrupt the local ecology, right? They're resilient systems. They have feedback mechanisms plugged into them. A great example of a feedback mechanism is, I don't know, y'all might be familiar with the Klamath Basin back in, was it 2000, 2001? It made national news. There was a water crisis. The Klamath Basin is in southern Oregon. Anyway, many of the indigenous communities, the Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuskin tribes, Native Americans, they foresaw the drought coming. Right? They had specific myths, right, that foretold about what to look for. Particularly a myth called the Bone Man, where there was this giant that got killed, and he fell down in the stream, And when the Bone Man is all about drought, he caused a major drought when he first arrived. And so when his bones are exposed, and his bones correlate in modern times to these big boulders that kind of look like a giant skeleton in the river. When they're exposed, when the water level is really low, it suggests that the Bone Man is returning, right? And local folks, indigenous folks, saw the drought coming from a mile away, and they already cut back on their use of water and harvesting of certain species of fish. That's a good example of a feedback mechanism. They're like, oh, hey, this is something that's happening in our environment that is causing us to reconsider our current use and adjust it accordingly. There's some great examples that look at the differences of energy costs between factory potatoes and Swidden agriculture in Papua New Guinea among the Simbaga. It's a really cool example. There's also potato chips versus manioc cakes in the Amazon. It's another case study that's highlighted in this week's readings. Kind of moving on. So that kind of touches on some of the social, political, and economic. But more on the environmental side in terms of the impacts that we see through this shift to large-scale production and global distribution and global systems of food production. We tend to see some really negative outcomes with such. Generally speaking, when we clear land, we're talking about deforestation, soil erosion, decrease in biodiversity, and an increase in what it is. I can't even read my own notes. And greenhouse gases. That's what that says. When we have decreased fallow periods, which fallow is when you let a field rest to recuperate nutrients in the soil. When you don't let that happen for a certain period of time regularly, you're going to over deplete the nutrients in the soil, and that actually impacts future crop production. With increases in irrigation, we tend to see increased rates of salinization and water depletion. I mean, look at the Colorado River. It was diverted and it has so many dams on it, the natural watershed can't even function by itself anymore. It has to be assisted by man. Not man, but people. And it diverts water from certain areas and distributes it to areas that don't have access to water, which in general creates a depletion of water. Chemical fertilizers definitely contribute to water contamination. I mean, our groundwater, our drinking water, things like that get polluted with agricultural runoff. Not just animal waste, but chemicals from the fertilizers and pesticides and whatnot. When we introduced mechanization to agricultural production, mechanization means using gas tractors, things like that, to prepare the soil, to maintain the crop, harvest the crop, distribute the crop, whatnot. That's all actually going to displace small-scale producers, right? When more people are producing on a large scale, it's going to make less room for small-scale producers to participate. Pesticides, pretty much the same thing as I mentioned for chemical fertilizers, except in addition to this, you're going to add that certain pests develop a resistance to these things, and it becomes this chemical war. You have to develop more pesticides that are more effective to counteract the pests that are developing a resistance. And it's just a vicious circle. And it has real clear environmental impacts. Monocropping. Monocrops are when you're producing a single crop, all right? Not intercropping, where you may actually produce, one of the great examples is corn, beans, and squash. They tend to be produced together, all right? One row of such, another row of another thing, and another row of another thing. Rinse and repeat sort of system. And actually, one of the key things in intercropping is that various plants use certain nutrients, and other plants replace them. All right, so it provides more of a sustainable system. And of course, giant agribusiness, this giant globalized food production system, results in a decrease in biodiversity overall, decrease in crop rotation, soil erosion, overproduction, increased social inequality. It's gonna, you'll end up with a relatively small group that controls the production, and everyone else is subject to it, and so you get real socioeconomic stratification. And of course, also it'll result in an increased loss of small-scale producers, because again, it's going to be displacing them. Yeah. Sorry if that was a bit of a whirlwind, but there's a lot this week. So that's where I'm going to leave this, and be sure to check out my video about was it Milestone 2? As well as our discussion for this upcoming week. Cool. I'll see you all on discussion boards, and hope you all have a good one. Take care. Bye.